December 23rd, 1974, Fort Worth, Texas. 2 days before Christmas, the city was exactly what you'd expect it to be that time of year. Department stores packed wall to wall with shoppers, parking lots jammed with cars, kids dragging their parents past toy displays, and cashiers ringing up last-minute gifts with the kind of tired smiles that only show up right before the holidays. That afternoon, 3 girls headed out into that chaos with one simple plan: finish their Christmas shopping and be home for dinner. 17-year-old Rachel Trelika was the oldest of the 3. By all accounts, she was responsible, level-headed, and mature beyond her age. She had recently graduated high school early and was already thinking about adult life in a way most teenagers weren't. People who knew her described her as cautious, especially when it came to rules and expectations. With her was Renee Wilson, 14 years old. Renee was energetic, talkative, and close to Rachel. The two had been friends for years, and Rachel often acted like a protective older sister around her. Renee's parents trusted Rachel, which mattered because that trust is what made the trip possible in the first place. The third girl was Julie Mosley, just 9 years old. Julie was Renee's younger friend, excited to tag along, thrilled at the idea of being included with older girls, and mostly focused on one thing: Christmas presents. She had begged her mother to let her go, promising she'd behave and stick close. That promise would haunt her family for decades. Rachel was driving her own car, a 1972 Oldsmobile 98. It was large, noticeable, and in good condition. Not the kind of car that disappears easily. The plan was simple. They would go to the Seminary South Shopping Center, finish buying gifts, maybe look around for a bit, and then Rachel would bring Renee and Julie back home. Rachel's husband was expecting to see her that evening. Renee's parents were waiting. Julie's mother assumed she'd be back well before dark. None of them had any reason to worry. Witnesses later confirmed seeing the girls at the mall that afternoon. They were spotted walking through stores, browsing, talking, laughing. They were seen in the parking lot. They weren't arguing. They weren't distressed. They weren't with anyone suspicious, at least not that anyone noticed at the time. This is important because it tells us something critical right away. Whatever happened to them did not start as chaos. At some point in the late afternoon, the girls left the mall. Where they planned to go next was never clearly established. Some believed they were heading to another nearby shopping area. Others thought they might have been going back toward Julie's house. But no confirmed sighting places them anywhere after they left Seminary South. That night, when Rachel didn't come home, her husband became concerned. When Renee didn't return, her parents assumed plans had changed and she'd stayed over at Rachel's house. When Julie didn't come back, her mother initially believed the same thing. It wasn't until later, when phone calls started crossing between households, that the truth settled in. None of them were where they were supposed to be. By the next morning, panic had replaced confusion. Families contacted police. Descriptions were given. Routes were retraced. Friends were questioned. But no one could say they had seen the girls after they left the mall. Then, later that day, police made a discovery that turned concern into dread. Rachel's Oldsmobile was found in the parking lot of the same shopping center they had visited the day before. It was parked neatly, not abandoned haphazardly, not damaged, not hidden. The doors were locked. Inside the car were their purchases. Wrapped gifts, bags from the stores. Everything they had bought for Christmas was still there, untouched. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no indication that anyone had been forced into or out of the vehicle. It looked like a car waiting for its owners to come back, but they never did. Police quickly realized how unusual this was. 3 girls don't simply vanish from a crowded shopping center 2 days before Christmas without leaving behind something, especially not when one of them is described as cautious and rule-bound. Rachel had promised multiple people she would be home that evening. Renee and Julie had no reason to run away. None of them packed clothes. None of them took money. None of them left notes. And yet, there they were, gone. By the end of December 24th, Fort Worth was no longer in holiday mode. Flyers were printed. Tips poured in. Detectives began piecing together timelines that ended abruptly in a mall parking lot. 3 girls had walked into Christmas crowds. Only their car came back. And that was just the beginning. By the afternoon of December 24th, the families weren't just worried anymore. They were frantic. Phone calls had confirmed that none of the girls were at each other's homes, and no one had heard from them since the previous day. What started as a few hours of concern had now turned into a full-blown missing persons case involving 3 children. Police began reconstructing the timeline from the moment the girls left Rachel's house on December 23rd. Rachel had picked up Renee and Julie around midday. The 3 left together in her Oldsmobile, heading towards Seminary South Shopping Center. The mall was busy, but not unusually so for 2 days before Christmas. No one noticed a stranger approaching them in a suspicious way. At some point in the late afternoon, the 3 girls walked out toward the parking lot. That's where the timeline begins to blur. One witness claimed to have seen them getting into Rachel's car. Another said they thought the girls were walking across the lot toward a different section. The problem was that none of these statements lined up cleanly. Every sighting was vague, and none could be confirmed with certainty. What investigators didn't know was this. By that evening, the girls had vanished, and Rachel's car was still sitting in the mall parking lot. When officers examined the vehicle, the details were strange in ways that didn't point clearly in any direction. The doors were locked. That meant either the girls locked the car themselves before leaving it, or someone else had locked it after them. There were wrapped Christmas presents in the back seat. Store bags were still inside. Rachel's purse was in the car as well, along with some personal items. But one thing was missing: the car keys. That detail bothered investigators from start. If the girls had walked away voluntarily, why take the keys but leave everything else behind? And if someone had abducted them, why lock the car and remove only the keys? It suggested movement. It suggested intention. But it didn't clearly suggest which direction that intention came from. Police canvassed the mall area, speaking with store employees, security guards, and shoppers who had been there that day. They hoped someone might remember seeing the girls with another person, or at least walking toward a specific exit or vehicle. But the mall had been crowded, and 2 days before Christmas, people were focused on their own errands. Faces blurred together. Cars came and went. Nobody had paid close attention to 3 girls in a parking lot. There was no confirmed sighting after they left the building. As detectives dug deeper, they began contacting friends, classmates, and relatives, trying to rule out the possibility that this was a planned runaway situation. What they found didn't support that theory at all. Rachel was engaged and planning her future. She had responsibilities, expectations, and a reputation for being cautious. She wasn't known for rebellious behavior, and there were no signs she intended to leave town. Renee had no history of running away either. Her parents described her as social and lively, but not troubled or secretive. Julie was only 9 years old. She hadn't packed clothes. She hadn't taken money. She hadn't even finished her Christmas shopping. There was no scenario where a 9-year-old would simply disappear voluntarily, especially 2 days before Christmas. Investigators also learned that Julie's mother had told her to be home by early evening. When Julie didn't show up, she initially assumed the girl had stayed at Renee's house. That assumption delayed the alarm, because for several hours, no one realized all 3 girls were missing at the same time. By the time police were notified, nearly a full day had passed since the last confirmed sighting. And in missing persons cases, time matters more than anything. Search efforts began around the mall and surrounding neighborhoods. Officers checked wooded areas, drainage ditches, and nearby roads. They questioned anyone who might have been in the area that afternoon. Nothing turned up. No witnesses. No physical evidence. No abandoned clothing. No signs of a struggle anywhere near the car. It was as if the 3 girls had simply stepped out of the parking lot and vanished into thin air. Then, just when the case was already confusing enough, a piece of mail arrived that would make everything far more complicated. It came addressed to Rachel's husband, and what it said would only deepen the mystery. The letter arrived in late December, just days after the disappearance. At the home Rachel shared with her husband, Tommy Trelika. It was addressed directly to him. The envelope had been mailed from Fort Worth, and the return address was written as if it had been sent by Rachel. At first glance, it looked like the kind of note you might expect from someone trying to explain an impulsive decision. But the longer you looked at it, the less it made sense. Inside was a handwritten message. In it, The writer claimed that Rachel and Renee had decided to leave town for a while. The note suggested they were safe and would return in about a week. It implied that Julie was with them. It also mentioned they were heading to Houston, though no explanation was given for why that specific city was chosen. The tone was casual, almost dismissive of the panic that had already started spreading through their families. And then there was the signature. The letter was signed Rachel, with an extra A in the name. People close to Rachel immediately noticed the spelling. She typically spelled her name Rachel. That small detail became one of the most debated elements of the case. Was it a simple mistake made under stress? Or was it written by someone who didn't know her well enough to spell her name correctly? Handwriting experts were brought in to examine the note. Their conclusions were cautious. Some believed the handwriting was consistent with Rachel's. Others felt there were irregularities that couldn't be ignored. The results were never definitive enough to close the question. Investigators also examined the envelope itself. The postage stamp had been affixed upside down. To some, that seemed intentional, possibly signaling distress. To others, it meant nothing at all. People placed stamps incorrectly all the time. There were no fingerprints recovered that could clearly identify who handled the letter. If the note was genuine, it suggested the girls had left voluntarily and were still alive at the time it was written. But that possibility created more problems than it solved. If they had left on their own, why abandon Rachel's car in a mall parking lot? Why leave behind her purse and personal belongings? Why take no extra clothing, no significant money, no visible preparation for travel? And most importantly, why would a 17-year-old take a 14-year-old and a 9-year-old with her without informing anyone, especially 2 days before Christmas? The content of the letter didn't address those questions. It didn't explain how they were traveling. It didn't provide a contact number. It didn't reassure Julie's family in any meaningful way. It simply stated they would return in about a week. They never did. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the promised return date came and went without any sign of the girls. No confirmed sightings in Houston. No bus tickets. No hotel records. Nothing placing them anywhere outside Fort Worth. The letter, which might have offered hope, instead became another layer of uncertainty. Some investigators began to suspect it had been written to buy time. If someone had abducted the girls, a letter implying they ran away would delay the urgency of the search and shift suspicion away from foul play. Others believed Rachel could have written it under pressure, possibly forced to calm her family and prevent an immediate manhunt. There was no physical evidence to prove either scenario. The case file grew thicker, but the answers did not. By early 1975, the disappearance of the Fort Worth trio had already defied simple explanations. There was no crime scene, no body, no confirmed suspect, just a locked car, missing keys, and a letter that raised more questions than it answered. And as investigators began exploring possible suspects and motives, they realized something unsettling. The girls might not have been taken by a stranger at all. As the investigation moved into 1975, detectives shifted their focus from the parking lot to the people orbiting the girls' lives. Because when there's no physical evidence, you start pulling on relationships and hoping something frays. Rachel's husband, Tommy Trelika, was questioned early and thoroughly. He had reported her missing when she failed to come home, and by all outward appearances, he was cooperative. There was no clear evidence tying him to the disappearance, and nothing concrete ever surfaced that placed him at the mall that afternoon. Still, investigators examined his timeline, his statements, and the dynamics of their marriage, looking for cracks. None appeared strong enough to build a case. Attention then drifted toward other men who had connections, however loose, to the girls. Over the years, several persons of interest emerged, though none were ever formally charged in relation to the case. One of the most discussed figures was a man named Glenn McCurley, a Fort Worth resident who lived near the Seminary South area in 1974. Decades later, McCurley would be convicted in an unrelated 1974 murder of a young woman named Carla Walker, a crime that occurred just days before Christmas in Fort Worth. That conviction, secured in 2020 through DNA evidence, reignited public interest in whether he could also be linked to the missing trio. However, law enforcement has never publicly confirmed any evidence connecting McCurley to the disappearance of Rachel, Renee, and Julie. The proximity in time and location raise questions, but questions are not proof, and the case file did not produce physical evidence tying him to the girls. Another name that surfaced over the years was that of a man who reportedly had a troubling history and lived in the area at the time. Allegations and suspicions circulated, including claims that he may have made incriminating statements. But those accounts were inconsistent, often secondhand, and never substantiated with forensic evidence. Investigators interviewed individuals connected to these rumors, yet nothing solid emerged that could move the case forward. Meanwhile, the letter remained a focal point. Some investigators leaned toward the belief that Rachel had written it, possibly under duress. The argument was that subtle irregularities in the handwriting could be explained by stress or coercion. Others maintained that the misspelling of her own name, along with the vague content, suggested someone else had composed it to mislead authorities. The postage stamp, placed upside down, continued to fuel speculation. Some interpreted it as a silent signal of distress, an old trope suggesting that an inverted stamp can mean the sender is in trouble. But there was never any confirmation that Rachel knew of such a signal or intended to use one. Without corroboration, it remained an interpretation layered onto an already fragile piece of evidence. As years passed, the investigation expanded geographically. Tips came in from across Texas and beyond. Reported sightings trickled through law enforcement channels. Each one had to be checked, and each one ultimately dissolved under scrutiny. No financial activity surfaced under Rachel's name. No verified employment records. No government identification renewals. No traceable paper trail that would suggest the girls built new lives elsewhere. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. 3 people disappearing completely without documentation or confirmed contact, especially one who was only 9 years old, strained the runaway theory to the breaking point. In 2001, the Fort Worth Police Department exhumed what were believed to be unidentified remains in hopes that advancing forensic technology might provide answers. Those remains were later determined not to belong to the missing girls. It was another lead that led nowhere. The file stayed open, the tips still came in, but the urgency that once filled the parking lots and living rooms of Fort Worth slowly faded into something quieter and heavier. For the families, though, nothing ever really faded. Rachel's husband, Tommy, eventually remarried, trying to build some kind of stable life after the sudden collapse of the one he had known. Friend would later say he carried a complicated mixture of hope and realism, sometimes speaking as though Rachel might still walk through the door, other times acknowledging that decades had passed without a single confirmed trace of her. Renee's family never stopped pushing for answers. Her mother, especially, continued speaking with investigators, journalists, and advocacy groups, determined to keep her daughter's name from disappearing into the background noise of unsolved cases. To her, the investigation was never an old story. It was a daily presence, the kind of quiet pain that settles into the routine of life and never truly leaves. Julie's disappearance remained the most haunting part of the case for many people. She had been only 9 years old, too young to have secrets, enemies, or complicated relationships. She had simply gone to the mall with her older sister and her sister's friend, expecting to see Christmas decorations and maybe buy a small gift, and then vanished into a mystery no one could explain. And even as forensic science solved other cold cases across the country, nothing definitive ever surfaced in this one. And so, as the years continued to pass, the official status of the case never changed. Still open, still unsolved. When they walked into Seminary South Shopping Center with Christmas only 2 days away. 3 girls, 1 car left behind, 1 unexplained letter, and then nothing. Nearly half a century later, the case still rests on the same quiet, unsettling possibility it always has. That someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened that day, and has simply never said a word.